Hi friends, Kathy here from Kathy Wiens Coaching. Well, today we are going to talk about anger. Now, in a previous video, I talked about fear and how things that are happening in our world today are creating a lot of fear. Well, today I'm going to use that same idea and talk about anger and how it is not wrong to be angry right now with all the stuff that is happening in our world. Now, I'm not going to, go into a lot of the current events that are happening, but what I really want to help you see in this video is that what we have been, what has been used, this emotion of anger that has been used to often shame us, is really good. It's really a form of wisdom. And so if you are feeling angry today, I want you to know that is okay. And we're going to talk more about why we feel angry and how we can manage that too. Because the truth is, anger can get out of control. We don't want that to happen. So those are the things that we'll be talking about today. So for much of my life, I believed that anger was something to be fixed, something to be managed, or maybe something to just be eliminated altogether. It was a problem emotion. It wasn't okay to feel angry. It was a sign that I was failing at being good, or I wasn't being kind, or maybe I wasn't being spiritual enough. And another thing that happens when we are afraid to express anger, it's because we have been groomed to believe that if we are angry, then we're going to be called a certain name. And you know what that name is. It's the B word. She's such an angry bee. I won't say it here, but you know what I'm talking about. And that's a fear a lot of women have, and that holds us down, that suppresses us, and makes us feel like we just have to be pleasing and kind to everyone. And I know that I'm not alone in this. Many women, especially those like me over the age of 50 or 60, were raised with these very specific messages: that anger is dangerous, that it makes you unlovable, or maybe that you were taught that it disturbs harmony. We want to keep harmony at all costs. It threatens connection. Maybe that's what we've been taught. So we've learned to tuck it away, to smooth it over, or worst yet, we've learned to turn it inward. And that can be so harmful to our mental health and then eventually to our physical health. But here's what I've come to understand through my own learned experience, through my extensive healing journey, and from talking to other women. Anger is not a character flaw. It's not bad, it's not wrong, it's not something to be avoided. Anger is really a form of wisdom. And like with all of our emotions, it's trying to tell you something. And so it's important to listen to it. Okay, so now we're going to talk about why so many of us, so many women, suppress our anger. So from an early age, many girls, like myself, we were rewarded for being accommodating, for being pleasant, for being self-sacrificing. We were praised for being easy or helpful or understanding. And anger did not fit that role, where anger led to punishment or withdrawal or shaming or sometimes even violence and abuse. Then your nervous system learned an important lesson. You don't even go there. You don't get angry. Now let me also say, even if you didn't grow up in an abusive home, the concept of being shamed for being angry can be very powerful. If we are shamed, that sends a really important message to who we are and how we are accepted, how acceptable we are to our family and our friends and society overall. And so even if you were simply shamed for being angry as a girl, as a young woman, that can cause us now as adult women to not express our anger. And then to add to that, cultural and religious messaging that frames anger as sinful or selfish or unfeminine. There's no wonder that many women learn to cry instead of rage. And that's another thing. Rage is also a very shameful word. We do not want to fly into a rage. That's really bad. We shouldn't do that. And while, yes, we need to control our anger, we should not be shamed when we are outraged by something. Like I said earlier, the things happening in our world right now, the things that are happening to certain people, makes me rage, makes me very angry. And that's appropriate. That's wisdom. Okay? It's not something that I need to be ashamed of. And another thing that we might do, so we might cry instead of rage. We might apologize instead of protest because of the way we were groomed to not express anger. And you know what? It's okay to protest. When something is going wrong, it's okay to protest what is happening. And it's okay to protest something that has happened to us. But what do we do instead? We will often, instead of protesting that this was wrong, we will often ask, what did I do wrong? And we may want to protest what is happening to other people. And we're seeing a lot of that today in our current world. But also, if we are ashamed by anger, if we believe that anger is wrong, rather than protesting what is happening to other people, we may tend to want to say, what did they do to bring that on themselves? We need to watch that too and recognize that might be coming from our own shame about being angry at something. And over time, anger doesn't disappear. Again, we can't push that emotion down and hope it will go away. It just goes underground. And like I said earlier, that can have very harmful effects to our physical and our mental health, and also our relationships and just our quality of life. Okay, so now we're going to go in a little bit deeper into how when we have experienced trauma and abuse in our childhood, and we have responded with fawning or people-pleasing, how that can have an even bigger impact on our ability to be angry as adult women. So when trauma enters the picture, anger often becomes more complicated. So for trauma survivors, especially those who learn to survive by, like I said, fawning or people pleasing, which that I'm one of those. I'm a recovering people pleaser. So when we are people pleasers, anger can feel like a direct threat to our safety and our belonging. If staying agreeable kept you connected or kept you protected, then anger felt like a risk that you just could not take. And I really understand that. That was true in my entire childhood. In both my biological family and also in my foster adoptive family. And I haven't shared that story yet. Maybe in a video I will share that. But there was abuse in my biological family, but in my foster adopted family, even though there were loving, kind people, they were very strict and their parenting style was very authoritarian, and that brought on shame and caused me to really not even be able to ever get angry with them. And that's not good, because kids need to be able to get angry sometimes. There are reasons for children to be angry. It's okay if your children get angry at you. Now, you help them learn how to manage it, but it's not a bad thing for your children to be angry. Okay? So, a little sidebar there. So, again, if you listen to override your own no, and that's what we do as people pleasers, if you learn to sense other people's needs before your own, do you recognize that? Have you ever done that? I know I have. And if you learn to stay quiet when something wasn't right, now we may stay quiet when something's happening to other people or to ourselves, your body will remember. Your body's going to remember that. Even if we push it down, like I've been saying, our body will remember. And when we swallow our anger, it doesn't just vanish. It settles into our nervous system, and it shows up as chronic tension, fatigue, resentment, anxiety, depression, and even a vague sense that there's really something wrong with me. And that's something I really work with on this channel, is to help my viewers, to help women, especially women in my stage of life, over 50 or 60, to understand there is nothing wrong with you. And I really work to help you discover what's right with you. And that's what we're doing in this video, to not say, oh, if I'm angry, I'm bad, or that's wrong. No, it's okay. There's not anything wrong with you. It's the right thing to be angry about many things, especially today, many things that are happening in our world. And let me say too, I'm in February of 2026, and we have a lot of stuff going on in our world today. Okay, so back to the video again. And so what we need to recognize is that our anger is a part of us, and that's okay. It's a good part of us. It's a part of us that knew a boundary was being crossed, or that the truth was being ignored, that a need was going unmet, either a need that we have or someone else had, and that there was a loss that was never acknowledged. So those are the things that anger communicates. And when we suppress our anger, then we're not able to communicate those things. So this is a unique way to look at anger, but I like it. I like the way this idea that anger is grief's loud cousin. Now I know that when I feel anger, most, if not absolutely all of the time, the underlying feeling is sadness and grief. There is something under there, under the anger. And I like this idea about the loud cousin because, you know, how many of you have a loud cousin or sister or girlfriend that, you know, is really tough and shows up, and maybe they protect you when you really can't protect yourself. And so that's what we're going to talk. We're going to reframe anger like that. And the grief may be saying, this mattered. This happened and it mattered. We don't need to push it down. And then the anger may come out by saying, this shouldn't have happened. This was wrong. This was an injustice. But really, we're saying the same thing. Okay? It's important to recognize that grief component of the anger. And when we lose safety or dignity, when we lose an opportunity, we lose our voice or our choice, those are things we grieve. But oftentimes when we don't allow ourselves to be angry, there's no place to grieve that. And so anger often carries that pain for us. That's how it protects us. It speaks on behalf of what was never able to be spoken, or maybe something that was never given to us. So for many women, anger holds grief for a childhood that we didn't get, or maybe for boundaries that we weren't able to have and still don't feel like we can have. And maybe the anger holds space for the years that we have spent shrinking ourselves. And another way to say that, and I often talk about that on this channel, is not just shrinking ourselves, but abandoning ourselves. You know, when we allow other people, when we are people pleasers and we allow other people to control how we live our life, then we're really abandoning ourselves. And we need to abandon, or we believe we have needed to abandon ourselves to survive, to stay safe. So seeing this way, when we see it this way, anger isn't destructive, it's protective. It's loyal, it's telling the truth when silence has gone on too long. Okay, so now we're going to talk about listening to the anger without letting it run the show. Because what we, just talked about a little bit ago is how, when we suppress anger, when we push it down, when we don't allow it to have a voice, then sometimes it can come up really in very, loud ways. and what might feel like destructive ways. And I think that's oftentimes why we don't express anger, is because we're afraid that it's going to come up and just, run the show in our lives. But we don't have to let it do that. We can see anger as wisdom, as a protective factor, and we can certainly learn how to use it. Okay? So reclaiming anger doesn't mean exploding, and it doesn't mean lashing out or harming others. That is not what anger is meant to do. But so often that's what we've been taught, and we need to let go of that. Anger means learning to listen to the anger with curiosity and respect. Ever thought about that? To respect that anger and to really listen to it? And ways to do that, we might want to ask ourselves some questions like, what feels unjust right now? So when we feel that anger coming up, if we can just pause and not try and push it away, not be afraid of it, but recognizing it's trying to help us. It has something to teach us. So then we can ask ourselves these questions. What feels unjust right now? What is a boundary that needs some attention? And then also we can listen to the anger for it to tell us what grief needs to be acknowledged. So we can really reshape anger in our lives when we pause and listen to it. Okay? Now, when anger is allowed to speak, it often softens. It's not that big explosive thing. It can be something that we can really work with that's softer. And when it's acknowledged and respected, it doesn't need to shout and to scream anymore. And again, that's what we're afraid of. So for me, learning to sit with anger rather than judge or suppress it has been an act of deep self-respect. I no longer see anger as a problem to fix, but it's a messenger that's trying to get me to pay attention to something. So again, seeing anger as something that's there to help us, to protect us, that we can learn from. And we can do that when we pause and we ask ourselves those questions. And we don't need to fear anger. We can actually change our relationship with anger. So if you have spent decades feeling like you're too much or you're not enough, it can feel radical and even scary to approach anger with compassion. So we can start gently. You don't have to like your anger. That's okay. We may still kind of be afraid of it. That's all right. You don't have to act on it and make it explode. We've talked about how to not do that. And you don't have to stop abandoning yourself when anger shows up, just to keep other people happy, to please other people. Because when anger shows up and it's met with care, it reveals something very precious underneath. It reveals what your real values are, your lessons that you can learn, and dignity, your core values. Now that is not a flaw, and it's not something to be avoided. It's something very precious. It's wisdom. Okay, so now we are going to talk about some ways that we can work with the anger. And these are just some very simple ways. If you would like me to do a video on more things that we can do, please put that in the comments. I'm happy to do that. But there are just simple ways that we can work with the anger to sort of dispel it in the moment, to get some of that energy out of the anger. Because that's some of the reason that we can be scared of anger, is because we feel like it's going to be too explosive. And so if we can just pause and do some things to kind of, like I said, expel that anger, that's going to help us. But we need to always remember that anger needs to be treated with respect and with presence and not with judgment, and that there are ways that we can work with it. So the first thing is we can, again, and we've talked a lot about this in this video, but we can acknowledge the message. We can ask ourselves, What is my anger protecting? Or those other questions that I had earlier. What's it protecting? Is it a boundary? Is it injustice? Is it, what's the grief? What's it protecting? What's the message? Now, often that will be that the answer is that it's a value, like I said, a boundary, or maybe a wound, something that has happened to us. So an important thing is to recognize, what is this anger protecting? Not to be afraid of it, but to listen to it. So we can give anger a physical outlet. So some just really simple things we can do. We can tear paper. So what is happening with this energy of anger, if we want to call it that? There's energy in our body. This anger is creating energy because, again, we are perceiving some kind of a threat. And so when our nervous system is activated, to dispel that, we need to do something active. So tearing paper, just really getting a piece of paper and ripping it all up. That's an action that releases that energy. Or maybe you could take a marker or crayons and just scribble on a piece of paper. You want to just get that energy out. Another thing that you can do is maybe go for a brisk walk or a run if you're able to do that. Maybe do some exercise or put on a really upbeat song and dance to it. Again, the idea is to be able to work with the energy. Sometimes we need to dispel some of its, to be able to work with the anger. Sometimes we need to release and dispel some of that energy that comes with the anger. And then another way to work with the anger is to contain before we communicate. So we dispel the anger, we acknowledge the anger, we recognize it's not a bad thing, it has a message to give us. We dispel some of that, some of the energy that it has, and then we can contain the anger before we communicate it, so that we're not communicating it in a rageful way. Because again, like I said, that's often what we're afraid of. And these are steps that you can take to use the anger in a productive way. So you don't have to act on the anger immediately. You can let it discharge first and then decide what, if anything, needs to be addressed. So to pause and to think about why is the anger there? What's it trying to communicate to you? You don't have to act on it right away. You can sort of let it go a little bit and figure out what it's telling you. And some ways to do this is maybe you can do some journaling about it. Because when we go into those trauma responses, when our central nervous system is activated, what's happening is we're in our limbic brain. But when we write about it, when we communicate, when we talk to someone, then that is in our prefrontal cortex, and we can work with it in a more, I'll say logical. I don't really like that term, but in our limbic brain, it's more emotional. In our prefrontal cortex, we can deal with it in a more rational way, let me say. And so writing about it, maybe talking to someone about it, maybe even just doing a video like I'm doing, maybe, not posting it or maybe posting it. But anyway, getting some communication out with it, that can be helpful. Also, maybe educating yourself, doing some research, see what's happening and figuring out what you can do, doing some research about things that you can actually do. Okay, so those are some ways that we can work with the anger. And then it's always important to remember that we don't judge the anger. We don't have to judge ourselves or judge the anger. When we feel angry, we don't have to be judgmental about ourselves. Feeling anger doesn't mean that you're cruel or that you're unkind. It means you're human. Okay, thank you so much for being here today. I hope this was helpful for you to understand anger in a different way, to understand where it comes from and why we have been taught as women to not be angry, and maybe some ways, some strategies to deal with it. And I want to just leave you with this last quote. Anger doesn't ask you to burn bridges. That is not what it's about. It asks you to notice it asks you to notice that your limits matter, and they do, and you matter. All right. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you have a good rest of the day.